Hello, so welcome to the next episode. Today got three subjects to talk about, and let's go back to the message from President Putin on the 8th of June last year. Putin said, "No, jeśli slirować te rekomendacjam, które прозвучали от вас, если мы хотим это сделать так максимально быстро, но нам действующего континента недостаточно, то мы придерживаемся, как я сказал, другой тактики. Мы выдавливаем противника из тех территорий, которые должны быть поставлены нам контроль. В этом смысле у нас нет никакой необходимости проводить мобилизацию. Мы этого не планируем, потому что в прошлом году мобилизация, которая нас прошла, но в прошлом году без всякой любовизации можно наши мужчины, наши люди посмотрели. And that's it for this message. And it was on the 8th of June 24. It was just a breathing. The next thing is very short article about I wrote it from Gombrich book, the small part of the history of the world. Looking back. The world now is so utterly different from what it was in 1918, and yet so many of the changes that occurred happened so imperceptibly that we now take them completely for granted. There were no televisions, no computers, no space flights, and no atomic energy. But it's easy to forget the most important change, and that is that there are so many more people in the world than there were then. Towards the end of the 1914-18 war, there were more than 2 trillion people on our planet. Since then, the figure has more than doubled. Then you must also realize that throughout the time that the population was multiplying at such a tremendous rate, the global we all inhabit was imperceptibly growing smaller and smaller. Technology, and in particular that of flying, kept on reducing the distance between the various parts of the globe. Today, there are hardly places in the world that can be reached in a matter of hours. Even if we don't go to the countries overseas, they seem closer to us than they were in my youth. Whether a major event happens anywhere in the world, we read it in the newspaper the next day, we hear about it on the radio and see it on the television news. The inhabitants of ancient Mexico knew nothing about the destruction of Jerusalem, and it has unlikely that anyone in China even heard of the effects of the 30 Years' War. But by the First War, things had changed. The very first fact that it was known as a world war was because so many nations had been drawn into the fighting. Everyone will know Adolf Hitler. He had been a soldier in the First World War, and he remained convinced that had it not been for the supposed deception, the German army would never have been defeated. He didn't just Blair Wilson, the enemy's propaganda had been crucial in persuading the Germans and Austrians and at home to abandon the soldiers at the front to their fate. In the years that followed the First World War, tolerance also vanished in Germany, Italy, and Japan. The politicians of those countries told their fellow countrymen that they had been cheated when the World War was shut out, and that they too had the right to rule over their other people. The ancient Roman ancestry, the Japanese of the warriors, and the Germans of the old German tribes were reminded of the Chalmen and Frederick the Great, people they were told were not of the equal value. Then, when a serious economic crisis in Germany condemned vast numbers of people to unemployment, was seemed the simplest way out. The unemployed would become soldiers or work in ornaments factories, and in this way the hateful treaties of Versailles and the Saint Germain would be wiped off the face of the earth. So on the first day of September in 1939, the German army marched into Poland. This time there were no cheerful battle songs and no dreams of glory. They were just doing their duty, for the madness had to be stopped. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next subject. The next matter I want to speak about, it's a very big subject. It's gonna take around half an hour, I think. It's very interesting. So we're gonna talk about ancient China. Okay. Okay, so the next subject is ancient China. The most striking fact of China's history is that it has gone on for so long. For about 3,500 years, there has been a Chinese people using a Chinese language. A unified central government, at least in name, has often been taken to be normal, in spite of periods of grievous division. As a civilization, China had been a continuing experience rivaled in duration only by that in ancient Egypt, and this longevity is the key to Chinese historical identity. China has first and foremost been a cultural unit, with a significant attraction for its neighbors. The example of India shows how much more important culture can be than government, and China makes this same point in a different way. That internally, culture may unify government easier. Somehow, at a very early date, it crystallizes certain institutions and attitudes which were to injure because they suited its circumstances. Some of these attitudes seem even to have transcended the revolutions of the 20th century. We must begin with the land itself, and at the first sight, it does not suggest much that make for unity. The physical theater of Chinese history is vast. China today is bigger than the United States and now contains over 4 times as many people. The Great Wall, which came to guard the northern frontier, was in the end made up to 2,500-3,000 miles of fortifications, made over 1,700 years. From Beijing, Peking to Canton, more or less due south, is 1,200 miles as the crow flies. This huge expanse contains many climates and many regions. Above all, northern and southern China are very different. In summer, the north is scorching and arid, while the south is humid and used to have floods. The north looks bare and dust blown in the winter, while the south is always green. One of the major themes of early Chinese history is of the spread of civilization by diffusion, migration, or conquest from north to south, and of the continual assimilation and irrigation of northern civilization by current from the outside, from Mongolia and Central Asia. As in other parts of the world, the coming of agriculture meant a revolution. In small sections of the area between the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers, this happened not long after 9000 before Christ. In a much larger area, people exploited vegetation to provide themselves with fibers and food. But this is still a topic about which much more needs to be known. Rice was being harvested in some areas along the Yangtze before the 18 millennium before Christ and ground just above the flood level of the Yellow River. Begins to yield evidence of agriculture, probably the growing of millet around the same time. Somewhat like that of early Egypt, the first Chinese agriculture seems to have been exhaustive or semi-exhaustive. The land was cleared, used for a few years, and then left to revert to nature while the cultivators turned attention elsewhere. From what has been called the nuclear area of North China, forms of agricultural techniques can be seen later to spread north, west, and south. Within it, there soon appear complex culture, which, combined with agriculture, the use of jade and wood for carving, the domestication of silkworms, the making of ceremonial vessels in forms which were to become traditional, and perhaps even the use of chopsticks. In other words, this was in Neolithic times already the home of much that is characteristic of the later Chinese tradition in the historic area. We can also find in these times the appearance of a clan structure and totems, which rules and regulations on behaviors within the clan or their family. Kinship in this form is almost the first institution which can be seen to have survived to be important in historical times. The evidence of the pottery too suggests some new complexity in social roles. Fragments of pottery dating from around 9000 before Christ have been found in several sites in north central China. Already these ceramics were both made by coiling clay, adding distinctive form of decoration, and hardening the words in fire. There are also clear signs that there were a differentiation between copper pots for everyday use and finer thin-bodied ceramics used for ritual occasions. Already things were made which cannot have been intended for the rough and tumble of food preparation and storage. Stratified society seemed to be emerging before we reach the historical era. One material sign of a future China already obvious at this stage is the widespread use of millet, a grain well adapted to the sometimes arid famine of the north. It was to be the basic staple of northern Chinese diet until about 1,000 years ago, and sustained societies which in due course arrived at literacy, the great art of bronze casting based on a difficult and advanced technology at the means of making exquisite pottery far finer than anything made anywhere else in the world, and above all at an older political and social system that identifies the first major age of Chinese history. The narrative of early times is very hard to recover, but can be outlined with some confidence. It has been agreed that the story of continuous civilization in China begins under the rules from a dynasty called Shang, the first name, with independent evidence to support it in the traditional list of dynasty, which was for a long time the basis of Chinese chronology. From the late 8th century before Christ, we have better dates, but we still have no chronology for early Chinese history, as well founded as that of Egypt. It is more certain that somewhere about 1700 before Christ, the Shang, which enjoyed the military advance of the chariot, imposed themselves on the neighbors of a sizable stretch of the Yellow River Valley. Shang kings lived and died in some state as slaves, and human sacrificial victims were buried within them in depth and lavish tombs. Their courts had archivists and scribes, for this was the first truly literate culture east of Mesopotamia. This is one reason for distinguishing between Shang civilization and Shang dynasty's paramountcy. These people showed a cultural influence which certainly extended far beyond any area they could have dominated politically. The Shang also contributed much in other fields, and it was, although it is uncertain how much of these advances originated with the Shang or was simply imported from other Chinese communities. It developed a rather exact calendar, which was the basis for all Chinese calendars up to the modern period. The Shang Age we know today so many independent communities in the larger region, including as far as from the Shangkou as Sichuan in the west. Most of them were found in the belt between the great rivers in the north, and it's likely that some of those had arrived at the level of development that was the equal of that of the Shang, though on a small scale with less organized power than it possessed. There was, of course, nothing given about this process, and the size of China has fluxed and waned within the power of the center and with its degree of unity. The predominant regime that was to replace the Shang in the 11th century before Christ is generally known as Zhou. It began as a small state which paid tribute to the Shang kings, but then confronted the biggest entity when, according to Chinese tradition, unreasonable demands were put to it. The Shang-Zhou transition sets the pattern in China of a cyclical change among dynasties, having and establish a great dynasty, which later becomes degenerate and rules by evil men. This leading state is then confronted and crushed by a new ruler who has the will of heaven on his side. Since the histories of the preceding dynasty were generally written by the dynasty that succeeded, it's not hard to imagine how the cyclical pattern was first established. The state which the Zhou king erected set the form of statehood in China for a very long time to come. Although there were still other states that in part cooperated and in part tried to join together against the predominance of the Zhou, the new dynasty became the model for any Chinese government, in part because it lasted so long, but also because it's a new framework for efficiency and justice. It spent 275 years at one capital, Wengao, known later as China's today's Xi'an, establishing it as China's main capital for nearly 2,000 years. Already in the first generation of its rule, the Zhou expanded all the way to the eastern coast of China, creating a much larger state than the region had ever known. The concept of spreading influence by setting an example of rule also originated with the Zhou kings, and even though the dynasty expanded its own domain, its main role in the creation of China was to form a pattern for the civilized government consisted of. The early kings, says a later commentary, took pain to exert their spiritual qualities, thereby persuading those who were destined to come into their own fold. The many states brought them gifts, and the leaders came in from all quarters, and as if they were close kinsfolk. The Zhou spread their influence by conquest, but also by their ability to achieve a cultural hegemony that was too long outlast their political predominance. The Zhou era in political terms was more or less over by 770 before Christ. The dynasty continued as the Eastern Zhou reserved. But increasingly politically relevant, its Fengao capital was destroyed by barbarian forces. The spring and autumn era, which lasted up to 480 before Christ, saw the gradual development of a multi-state system which included states set by groups that had never been under Zhou predominance but which had by now accepted Zhou government forms and rituals. The mid-first millennium before Christ saw in China fundamental increases in agricultural productivity, which soon could sustain a much larger population. The main breakthrough were in irrigation and in better tilling of the land, which made for greater yields. Communication increased, and so did trade. Attempts by each state to control trade were more than made up for by the need of each territory and the protection individual states were willing to give to its traders. At the end of the spring and autumn period, there was in China a profound and prolonged sense of social and political crisis. As a result, there was a burst of speculation about the foundation of government and ethics, and the era was to remain famous at the time of the 100 schools when wandering scholars moved about from patron to patron, expounding their teaching. One sign of this new development was the appearance of a school of writers known as legalists. Confucius' birth name was Kong Hui, and he was born in the minor state of Lu in 551 before Christ. Since his father died when he was very young, he was brought up by his mom and probably trained as a bookkeeper. His family consisted of many important scholars and officials, and Confucius himself was to spend some time as a minister of the state and then officer of grannies, but probably never rose above a minor official rank. When he could not find a ruler to put into practice his recommendations for just government, he turned to meditation and teaching. His aim was to present a purified and more abstract version of the doctrine he believed to lie at the heart of the traditional practices, and thus to revive personal integrity and discipline his service in the government class. He was a reforming conservative, seeking to teach his pupils the essential truth of ancient ways, Dao, materialized and abstracted by routine. This was teaching likely to produce men who would respect the traditional culture, emphasize the value of good form and regular behavior, and seek to realize their moral obligations in the scrupulous discharge of duties. It was immediately successful in that many of Confucius' pupils won fame and worldly success. Though his teaching deplored the conscious pursuit of such goals, urging rather than a gentlemanly self-effacement. But it was also successful in a much more fundamental sense, since the generation of Chinese civil servants were later to be drawn into the precepts of behavior and government which he laid down. Documents conduct loyalty and faithfulness for precepts attributed to him as his guidance of government helped him to form reliable, sometimes disinterested and even human civil servants for hundreds of years. Confucius' texts were later to be treated with something like religious awe. His name gave great prestige to anything with which it was associated. He was not said to have compiled some of the texts later known as the 13 Classics, a collection which only took its final form in the 13th century. It's striking that for the rest of his life, he died in 479 before Christ, Confucius had so little to say about the supernatural. In the ordinary sense of the word, he was not a religious teacher. He was essentially concerned with practical duties and emphasized his shared with several other Chinese teachers of the 5th and 4th century before Christ. The period that followed Confucius' death, known as the Warring States, lasting roughly from 481 to 221 before Christ, in many ways stood for the opposite of everything that the great sage had insisted on. An era of this unity produced a time of intense warfare as the interstate system created around the Zhou dynasty long decline broke down. The most powerful states engaged in a series of wars which created countries of a new kind organized for maximum military benefit. Then Sunghi's principles were those of inner cohesion and outward duplicity, according to the art of war. All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make them believe we are near. Hold out by baits to entice the enemy. Feign disorder and crush him. Okay. Sanzi also recommended a centralization of the means necessary to wage war. The nobles must pay taxes to the center and always be willing to follow the king into battle. As times had passed on to noblemen could afford more expensive weapons, ammo, and horses, which increasingly came into use. The warrior, using a chariot as a platform for archery, before descending to fight the last stage of the battle on foot with bronze weapons, evolving in the last century of the pre-Christian era into a member of a team of 2 or 3 armed warriors, moving with a company of 60 or 70 attendants and supporters, accompanied by a battle wagon or 70 attendants and supporters. Like in the much fainted period that preceded it, the Warring State era was not just about this united conflict and destruction. It was also an era of great cities and palaces, of great art, and of advance in science and medicine. And China's bronze art and ceramics developed further, but was now accompanied by the creation of delicate forms of lacquerware, textiles, and silk. And the recent find from Yangtze province in south-central China shows aristocratic dresses made of fine silk based on stunning dyeing and weaving techniques far more advanced than those of earlier periods. Astronomy was another field that expanded much during this time. Religion had considerable repercussions of political forms. The heart of the first ruling houses claimed to obedience was their religious superiority. The family emerged as a large refinement and subdivision of the clan, and the Zhou period was the important one in its clarification. There were about 100 noble clans, within each of which marriage was forbidden. It was supposed to be founded by a hero or a god. The patriarchal heads of the clan families and houses exercised special authority of its members and were all qualified to carry out its rituals. Though Chinese society was to grow much more complex by the end of the Warring State period, the distinction of common people from the nobly born remained. There were important practical consequences. The nobility, for example, were not subject to punishment, such as mutilation inflicted on the commoner. It was a survival of it in later times than the gentry were exempt from the beatings which might be visited on the commoner. Though of course they might suffer appropriate and even die punishment for very serious crimes. The nobility long enjoy various modality of metal weapons. None of the less, there were not the critical distinction of status which lay elsewhere in the nobleman's special religions, tending through a monopoly of certain ritual practices. I think that would be it for today, and I will be recording the next episode very soon. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.